Support for this edition of In Focus is provided by the Herald Times local news app for iPad, iPhone, and Android. Use it to join the community conversation. To find the Herald Times news app, go to your app store and search Herald Bloomington. And by WTIU viewers like you. Thank you.
The U.S. Department of Transportation has called Interstate 69 one of America's 6 corridors of the future. Its route from Brownsville, Texas, north through Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana, up to Port Huron, Michigan, is intended to facilitate trade with Canada and Mexico. Crews began construction in Indiana in 2008. But as we'll discuss tonight, the history of the road from Indiana spans more than 2 decades. Tonight, during this special edition of In Focus, we debut I-69. Are we there yet? Thanks for joining us. I'm WFIU WTIU News Bureau Chief Sarah Whitmire. We'll get to the documentary in just one moment. While you're watching tonight's presentation of I-69, Are We There Yet?, we invite you to send in your questions or comments to news@indianapublicmedia.org. Or you can give us a call at 1-800-987-9848. You can also visit our website at indianapublicmedia.org/I69 to participate in our live chat or submit your questions via Facebook or Twitter. Following the documentary, our panel of experts will respond to your questions. In studio tonight are Daviess County Director of Economic Development Corporation, Ron Arnold. From the Bloomington-Monroe County Metropolitan Planning Organization, Richard Martin, and the co-founder of Citizens for Appropriate Rural Roads, Thomas Tokarski. Without further delay, we present I-69, Are We There Yet?
Southwestern Indiana really is the only part of the state that doesn't have reasonable interstate access.
Bloomington and Monroe County clearly do not need this I-69. They're doing very well without it.
It's all part of trying to create a climate of opportunity in this state.
It's a boondoggle, and it's classic pork barrel.
The environmental impact statement is the most extensive one that the feds have ever done. So I think they've got it right.
If you listen to the mayors along the proposed I-69, it sounds like we're going to be building about 50 new Toyota plants in the next 10 years.
When I think about I-69, I think, again, jobs first.
It will be a financial drain for decades and decades. That's guaranteed.
More than 1,600 miles from Canada to Mexico, 8 states, billions of dollars. And the idea for Interstate Highway 69 started here, Washington, Indiana. It was a chance breakfast in 1990 that brought David Reed and David Graham together. Reed was on assignment with the Hudson Institute, an economic think tank under the leadership of future Governor Mitch Daniels. It was Reed's job to look at ways to bring economic development to southwestern Indiana.
I was fortunate to find a bed and breakfast that was in Washington, Indiana, and it was owned by a fellow named David Graham. This was actually purely serendipitous, but it turns out that David was not only the proprietor of this absolutely beautiful bed and breakfast, but he was also an activist in the community. He and his family for generations prior to him had been working very hard to try to ensure that Washington and the region around it had a vibrant economic base and was a thriving community.
We all met in my kitchen, and I gave them all omelets. None of them died, so I guess they were all right.
David Graham, as it turns out, was an important businessman in the area. His family had thousands of acres in Washington and Daviess County. They owned several turkey farms and a dairy business. His family's legacy extended to the 1800s. The Grahams settled in Daviess County only a couple of years after Indiana became a state. They were early pioneers in the automobile industry. They made trucks for Dodge, and they manufactured the first Pope-mobile.
We were left out of the highway system when it was formulated, I guess by accident, because it's clear that I-69, it goes from Michigan down to Indianapolis, should have been continued on south.
And if you was not close or had access to a rail, you wasn't gonna survive. And so then that need began to change back over to trucks.
Washington needed a road. David Cox led economic development efforts in this region. He remembers giving a tour to a company thinking of locating in Washington. Flying over the city, they looked down and asked, "Where are the roads?" The winding 2-lane country roads cutting through farm fields looked like a great place to take a country drive, but not an efficient route to move goods or people. The company chose not to locate in Washington.
And that's why it becomes nearly a passion with us to at least to try to get back even, to get to the point where we got a 4-lane to go someplace.
It has a lot to do about perception. So if you're a company and you want to locate your business somewhere, build a Toyota plant or a Walmart distribution center, you want to be within X miles of an interstate. And some local economic development guy can come to you and say, well, you would be within 2 miles of this divided 4-lane road, which is perfectly nice, but they kind of have their checklist. It's meaningful from an economic development perspective, whether you're a U.S. highway or an interstate. That's a big difference.
The folks in Washington, as well as their neighbors to the south, had been dreaming of a highway from Evansville to Indianapolis. But a federally funded study in the late 1980s by Chicago-based Donahue and Associates made that seem all but impossible. The study suggested the cost of the highway would not justify the potential economic benefits it might bring. That didn't surprise the economist David Reed. In fact, he agreed.
And he looked at the route, and he looked at us. He said, "Graham, there's only one way you're ever going to get this road built or even started, and that is to get other states involved. Because without other states, you won't make any progress in Washington, D.C."
If the road were confined to Indiana, it would never get the federal support necessary to get it approved. But according to Reed, if it was a major north-south interstate connecting Canada, Mexico, and the United States, then the lawmakers in Washington, D.C. would be interested in a road through Washington, Indiana.
Looking at the map, seeing that linkage didn't currently exist, seeing that at the time the North American Free Trade Agreement was still on the table, had not yet been signed, but if it were to be signed, that would change the trading terms among the three countries, and yet there was no infrastructure to support that initiative either. So it just seemed to me to make eminent good sense to be exploring that option. And that's what we sort of threw out on the table that morning.
The group was confident the potential economic benefits that a NAFTA superhighway could bring would justify the road's costs that were questioned in the Donahue study when the road was only an Indiana highway.
They understood almost intuitively that to take it from a regional context to a national and international context would have benefits that far outweighed the costs associated with it, and that would still have the kind of impact that they wanted in support of their regional economy and the area that they were most directly concerned about.
The timing for this idea couldn't have been better for the highway supporters. Politically, the stars were perfectly aligned in Washington, D.C. During the 90s, some of the most powerful federal legislators were from I-69 states. Dick Armey was from Texas, as was Tom DeLay. Trent Lott was from Mississippi. Al Gore, the vice president, was from Tennessee. And the president of the United States, Bill Clinton, was from Arkansas. The expanded I-69 ran through each one of these states. It would eventually link Canada to Mexico while running through Washington, Indiana, creating the largest free trade area in the world.
It's going to be interesting to see how they get all this all done.
Tom Baumert was the mayor of Washington at the time. He immediately saw the good fortune an interstate could bring. Faster commutes, no more getting stuck behind trucks, no more school buses bringing traffic to a standstill. Fewer accidents because people wouldn't be driving winding country roads, and no more companies passing over his town because there wasn't access to good roads. The boom days Washington saw in the 1800s would return, but this time an interstate rather than the railroad would be the driving force.
If you can get the manufacturers in here and located here, what do? They spend money in your community. They buy your cars. They buy tickets to the various functions. They buy all their groceries here. You can develop stores that they'll be buying product in. So you need something to draw them here, to get them here to begin with. If you want to have an impact, someplace for your kids to stay and work, or your grandkids, you've got to get industry into the place. You've got to have these nice office jobs for the educated kids and grandkids, and a reason for them to return to Washington to go back to work.
Safety was also a big reason for wanting the road when you consider the number of semis in this area each day hauling everything from grain to coal, and even dangerous ammunition leaving the Crane Naval Surface Warfare Center, a nearby military facility.
The federal people begin to allow longer semis. And as these semis get longer, then it's more dangerous for them to be out here on these two-lane roads. My wife and I ride motorcycle, that's our hobby. And you come around a curve and there's a semi partially over in your lane. All too often, those issues come up, and there's been folks that's been hurt pretty bad. It just increases the safety, and when we send our people out, we kind of like to have them back every night.
I know years ago, when they were first moving ammunition through here to go to the Desert Storm, they called me to let me know that at 2 o'clock in the morning there's going to be 15 semis come through your town. Well, I lived just one building away from the stoplight that they were going through, and but they had to let us know to be prepared. They're not going to, the lights are all going to be on flash, and they're not going to stop or anything. They're going through, but if one of them would blow up, they have about an 8-block impact. So if they're up on an interstate, we can all feel a lot safer.
Research from the Federal Highway Administration shows the fatality rate on the nation's interstate system is about 60% lower than that of all other roads. A report from 2001 estimates that in that year, 6,000 fatalities were avoided because of the country's interstate system. So with the local goals of economic development and improved safety, and the national goals of improving international trade, the folks in Washington began their crusade to build I-69.
We decided at that time that the community needed it, and if the community needs it, we're in favor of it. Because that was the attitude of my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather. We need to work on things that are going to help the community.
So then we decided we had to get the senators and stuff on board, so a group of us went to D.C. And we were going to meet with Senator Lugar one day, and we went over there at our appointed time that we thought we had. Turned out it had been changed, but nobody had notified us. So we go in, and she says, "You can't see him. He's in with a bunch of generals from some foreign land, I think maybe even Panama, I think it might have been." But she said, "Your appointment had been changed till this morning. You should have been here this morning." So David Graham, who was our right arm of everything, and a pretty good politician, unbeknownst to me, I guess, handed her his card and said, "Would you tell Senator Lugar that I'm out here?" And it was almost immediately that he came out escorting these generals to sit in the waiting room while he took us back to talk to us, you know. And I thought, wow, I believe this guy is politically connected. So then we talked for a long time, and he emphasized the same thing to us. He said, "I think it's a good idea to be international with it, and I think we can get the backing, but the first thing you've got to do is get your governor's backing."
The southern portion of it has been championed by people in Evansville for as long as I have been in politics. It's been championed by others at various stages, but with less enthusiasm.
David Graham started making trips up and down the proposed I-69 corridor from Canada to Mexico, stopping in small towns, talking to people who worked at Chamber of Commerce offices or who were politically connected, and helped people envision the good fortune that could come from building a NAFTA highway.
He was very well connected politically, and he also was very good with the financial community. David had credibility wherever he went. So the more we got into this, the more of a role that he played.
My father had the philosophy that if you call on a company, you start out with the guy that opens the door. Because if you don't have him on your side, you'll never get the next man and the next man until you get to the person you need to talk to. So I talked to an awful lot of doormen and an awful lot of clerks and secretaries along the way. The amazing thing is that they're the biggest help you could possibly have, because they keep jabbing their boss. Look into this, what Graham says. Maybe there's something to it. Because it would mean an improvement to their job, more money for them.
60 miles northeast near the college town of Bloomington, Indiana, Thomas and Sandra Tokarski were actually sleeping a bit more soundly. They thought a planned regional highway that would have cut through their backyard was off the table after the Donahue study found such a project was economically unfeasible.
The Donahue study was published, I guess, in 1990. And it came out, and they had looked at several different possibilities, and they did not recommend any of them, basically because of a poor cost-benefit ratio. And so we thought, well, that's it, it just got shot down.
So the Tokarskis went about their business, Sandra working at an art store in Bloomington and Thomas working at Indiana University in the School of Optometry. But during the summer of 1990, the Tokarskis went to a planning meeting at the local fairgrounds. The plans for the Indianapolis to Evansville, or the Southwestern Highway, were brought up again. The Tokarskis were under the impression the road had died with the Donahue study. But it was clear the state was determined to build it anyway. Governor Evan Bayh had filed an addendum to the Donahue study that called attention to a number of problems with the original report. And ultimately, it suggested the road would have a significant economic benefit and should be built.
Spend all that money doing the study, doesn't come out the way you want it, so we're not going to forget it, waste all that money, and we're going to do it anyway.
That night, the Tokarskis wrote a letter to U.S. Senator Richard Lugar explaining how the road was a bad idea for Indiana.
And then we started talking to neighbors, and people were outraged. We couldn't. We wanted maps. We called the county engineer. He didn't have a map. We called INDOT. They didn't have any maps. They're going to build a multi-billion-dollar highway, and they didn't have any maps. So anyway, what we did is we got together. We called friends, Brian Garvey, who lives about a half mile that way, and some other neighbors that lived down Evans Road. We said, well, let's get together, and we sat around Bill Garvey's kitchen table and talked what we were going to do.
And Brian Garvey is a wonderful graphic artist, and he drew up a little flyer, and we went around door to door with our petition, giving people the flyer. We got a notice in the paper.
I mean, it is the thing about NIMBY, not my backyard. I mean, that's where everything begins. Typically you personally feel something about an issue, and that's how you can personally become involved in it.
Note of disclosure, Garvey's wife works at the producing station of this documentary. She is not involved in news reporting. Garvey and the Tokarskis were part of a small group that planned to gather at a local firehouse in October 1990. Almost 200 people attended to get information and learn about the latest plans for building the Southwestern Highway. The highway project now had organized opposition. The Tokarskis and Garveys wanted to pick a name for their group that didn't suggest they were angry anti-road people. They wanted something that would show they valued quality infrastructure, but they questioned the value in building new roads when existing ones could be repaired or upgraded. They settled on CAR, Citizens for Appropriate Rural Roads.
Tom and Sandra are expert grassroots organizers. I mean, they get it. They understand what it takes.
The Tokarskis are longtime environmental activists. Thomas was arrested in the 1970s for protesting the construction of the Marble Hill nuclear facility on the Ohio River in Louisville. His arrest helped publicize the dangers associated with the plant, and the plant that was once considered a done deal ultimately wasn't built. The Tokarskis had similar success a few years later, showing that the former Westinghouse plant in Bloomington had dumped hazardous waste into limestone quarries and garbage dumps. Building on that experience, they began circulating petitions, visiting county fairs, and learning everything they could about transportation policy. These were the days before the internet, though, and the Tokarskis really didn't know what they were up against. They were still under the assumption that the proposed road would be an Indiana highway. They had no idea that it had grown to a proper superhighway connecting nations. So on one side, Carr was essentially unaware what was going on. Meanwhile, the proponents of the road were gaining momentum. They'd formed their own organization called the Mid-Continent Highway Coalition. And thanks to the efforts of David Graham, the group eventually had important supporters from many of the cities and states along the route. In November of 1991, I-69 made it into a federal transportation bill. This meant I-69 had a political heartbeat. It admittedly was faint since there was no money for the road, but it was beating.
The people involved in the Mid-Continent Highway Coalition early on were smart people, very active in their community, but they weren't necessarily savvy about how to go about building a huge interstate. And who can blame them, because no one had really tried this before.
Matt Dellinger literally wrote the book on Interstate 69.
They kind of were rolling along in a semi-naive but very optimistic state for a couple of years, and they had trouble getting Houston involved. There's no real need for us to kind of roll ourselves in with these people from Kentucky and Indiana. That's too complicated. So they initially said no. No, we don't want to join your coalition.
But decision makers in Houston began to have second thoughts when Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio signed on to the project. Houston didn't want the other cities to get all of that traffic.
And that kind of got their competitive juices going, and they said, okay, we'll join the Mid-Continent Highway Coalition. We have to hire some professionals. We need to pay lobbyists. Not a PR person, not a government affairs person, a lobbyist, a guy who's going to sit there when the bill's being written, stand over the shoulder of the congressional aide, that kind of work, the kind of nitty-gritty that you need to get what you want into bills.
The Houston Chamber of Commerce recommended the coalition hire Tom DeLay's brother, Randy, as a lobbyist. Randy DeLay understood how to navigate the political process and how to play the game when necessary.
If you're a congressman and you've got a lot of people asking you for a lot of things, gee, maybe you're more inclined to listen to the person who just wrote you a check or held you a fundraiser. And there was a lot of that going on, throwing a fundraiser in Arkansas for a congressman from Alaska, who happens to be the head of the House Transportation Committee. So, when you look at it all, when you look at all the stuff that went on lobbying-wise, it's pretty clear what was happening.
By this time, the members of CAR had heard rumblings about a NAFTA highway, but they dismissed the idea. However, when they found out about the route making it into a federal transportation bill, they knew the proposed interstate was more than a myth. The Tokarskis started digging. It turns out the environmental impact study was conducted by an early supporter of the road and one of David Graham's friends who stood to gain a lot if the road were built.
What's interesting is in the case of Interstate 69 in Indiana, the company that the firm that ended up doing the big statewide study to say, well, let's look at this again now that it's a national project and now that we found these flaws in the Donahue study. The firm that was chosen to do that study the new study was run by Bernardin and Lockmuller in Evansville. And Keith Lockmuller had been one of the primary people on this committee in the Evansville Chamber of Commerce trying to get them to build this road. Here's a guy who publicly stating he wants to build the road. His firm's put in charge of studying whether we need the road.
To some, BLA's involvement was questionable, since according to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, the study was supposed to be objective. BLA officials refused to be interviewed for this documentary, but in a video produced for the I-69 groundbreaking ceremony, BLA co-founder Keith Lockmuller talks about his involvement in getting the road built.
Wow. I was the director of Evansville Urban Transportation, and I go back as far as maybe 62, 63, talking about some route, straight route up to Indianapolis. So we've been around a long, long time, and I finally see that we're going to build this.
Linton Caldwell was one of the principal authors of NEPA and a highly regarded national expert on environmental policy. He made his home in Bloomington, Indiana, where he was a professor at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. In the late 90s, he spoke on one occasion about the I-69 study. In a letter to the editor of the local paper, he said the independence and objectivity of the environmental impact statement was suspect, having been prepared by a private consulting firm to, quote, defend the state's badly flawed plan, presumably to give INDOT an impact statement that would support its predetermined preferences. The Tokarskis had read and understood the National Environmental Policy Act. They thought a clause buried in the bill might be their way out. It said a state could not build a road without looking over every possible alternative. It was also required to do the due diligence to see if it was necessary to even build a road in the first place. Carr changed its strategy and came out with a new slogan, "No New Terrain." The group was giving up its fight to stop the road and the big-name politicians in D.C. They recognized I-69 was coming, but they were proposing that it take an alternate route through Indiana. When they looked at the map for possibilities the state could consider, they discovered a 4-lane route from southwest Indiana to Indianapolis already existed. State Route 41 from Evansville to Terre Haute to Interstate 70 to Indianapolis. The members of Carr argued that upgrading this route to interstate standards would cost less, meet the goals of extending I-69, and be less damaging to the environment than building a new road. The supporters of the highway believed the current proposed direct route was the most sensible route. It was a better route because it was shorter.
I drove over to 41 one time and went up to 70 and across to Indianapolis, and whew, that was a long trip. and then if you really start looking at all the businesses and houses that are going to have to be bought and moved or relocated, it's huge. It would have been really, I know it's easy to say, well, upgrade 41 and use that. Well, that's not a direct route.
As you better educate people, they can make more intelligent decisions. And most of these people do not want to be educated. They want to say, I don't care what it is, but I know I'm against it. And I know as you head a little bit further north, you get into that. And they have their 4-lane, and we don't.
To members of Carr, using the existing route from Evansville to Terre Haute to Indianapolis made so much sense they publicized it as the Common Sense Route. Andy Knott was a policy director at the Hoosier Environmental Council. He says the common sense of doubling up I-69 with US 41 and I-70 lay in the relatively minimal impact on the land.
The Common Sense Route would not go through the Patoka National Wildlife Refuge. It would not go through any karst area, through any area where there are caves. The impacts on wetlands were dramatically less. It's a no-brainer to use that route. And there, a lot of things led up to that. There was, a lot of national news coverage. NBC did the Fleecing of America piece. ABC did a It's Your Money piece. There was starting to become a lot of national attention to this boondoggle, really.
Friends of the Earth did at that time a Green Scissors report, which is focusing on projects that are damaging to the environment and damaging to the taxpayers' dollars. And we had Arnold the Pig come, and we made a giant check and for whatever the cost of the highway was, and Arnold the Pig used the scissors to cut that up. It basically was a pig's outfit that Andy had rented from someplace.
The EPA responded and called for a new environmental impact study. If there were a better route that would be less damaging to the environment, the EPA thought INDOT should consider it.
I felt vindicated that these agencies were agreeing with something we've been saying for years.
While the opponents for a new highway felt vindicated, the original supporters of the road from Washington, Indiana were fearful. If the state had to look at other routes, then the highway they'd been working so hard to build for so many years might not go through their community. INDOT agreed to the public outcry and to the EPA's recommendation. They called for another study. There would be two goals. One, determine whether the road should be built, and two, what route it would take. The state also came up with a new purpose and need statement. Provide a new road that strengthens the transportation network in southwest Indiana, supports economic development in southwest Indiana, and completes the section of the National I-69 project between Evansville and Indianapolis. Members of CAR felt the purpose and need statement slanted the study toward the new terrain route.
If you make the purpose and need of the interstate to connect Evansville and Indianapolis as directly as possible, well, that certainly points to one route over another, doesn't it? I mean, if the purpose and need was to enhance mobility while protecting the environment, that logic would go through the objective numbers to another conclusion. But as long as you have the stated purpose of the study to find the route that will most directly connect, you're going to end up choosing the route that most directly connects. The state said, well, they have all the expertise, of course we're going to hire them again. Opponents said, hey, wait a minute, didn't they screw up once, can't we get someone else? But Bernard and Lockmuller went and started a new study, which is bigger than a phone book, had to do with how many trees, how many wetlands, how many Indiana bats, how many this and that. The only meaningful numbers to the people who were eventually going to decide where to put I-69 were the numbers about economic development and number of miles.
Under the National Environmental Policy Act, part of that legislation is that you have to take public comment. They have to take comments from the public. And that's part of the public involvement process on it. It's really important for citizens to be involved as much as they can, as much as we can. And that means doing all those boring things like going to meetings, writing letters to elected officials, writing letters to agencies, writing letters to the editor.
It just seemed like they would always downplay the opposition, and that was always very frustrating. And again, I think that was just political. I mean, there was so much behind the scenes support for the project that they couldn't acknowledge that the majority of people were opposed to it.
But unfortunately for the Tokarskis, the study was not an act of curiosity. It was not about, let's figure out what the right thing to do is. It was essentially paperwork that the state had to do, and they were ticked off that they had to do it again. And you get that sense in all of the hearings if you watch the hearings from 2002, I mean, person after person is standing up and giving an impassioned speech about why they think that the road through Terre Haute, it's only 8 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever longer. It's half the cost. You save the towns along 41 from obliteration. There were all of these pretty compelling reasons, if you were an objective viewer, for seriously considering 41 and 70.
I never did think it was the time saved. I always thought it was the safety factor involved. And I kept saying, well, you're talking about environmental impacts. Look, when they build an interstate, they build those environmentally friendly. Right now, all of our ditches out here, if you'd have a major spill from a semi or something, it's going to go right down the ditch to the creek to the river. These interstates, they're built to stop them right in the general area. They're not built to let them flow everywhere.
Tom Balmer was sweating it out because it seemed like another route was seriously being considered.
There was a few times when we'd all come to a meeting, a quickie meeting somewhere, and say, hey, we're in trouble here. It looks like they're trying to direct us some other direction. We've got to derail this thing. And there was no simple way to derail it. You had to wait till the environmental impacts come out.
During his time in office, Balmer raised money to restore the city's parks, buy a new fleet of city vehicles, build a new water treatment plant. The list goes on and on. All of these things Balmer did with one goal in mind, improving the future for his kids and grandkids. Baumert was at a conference in Indianapolis not long after taking office. Governor O'Bannon's wife, Judy, was delivering the closing remarks, and she challenged the officials sitting in attendance to look in the mirror every day and ask themselves what they did to make the world better for their grandkids. If the answer was nothing, then they should be ashamed of themselves. Baumert says that message stuck with him. He thought about it the whole drive back to Washington, and after that made it one of his goals to do something every day that would benefit his grandkids. Baumert understood where some highway opponents were coming from and agreed he wouldn't want an interstate cutting through his backyard either. But Baumert was pleading for folks to remember this was about something bigger. The fear in Washington was they wouldn't get the road, and the people in Terre Haute and south along 41 would see the economic impact they'd been fighting for so long to bring to their town. There was precedent for this sort of thing. Washington had been passed over for a road before, so longtime residents knew the governor could and potentially wouldn't hesitate to change the route.
Look at Seymour, Indiana. Several years ago, Seymour, Indiana and Washington, Indiana were the same size. They both were on US 50. They both were on the B&O Railroad. Well, then here come the interstate through, and it went east of them, 4 or 5 miles. And the city of Seymour prepared for that. They started running sewer and water out there. And if you look now, they grew to the interstate. So the same thing would apply here along I-69.
There's no doubt that the interstates changed the development patterns in this country immensely. Not only did it kind of pick winners and losers as the routes were made, but it also it made it easier for people to move from the cities out into the suburbs. It created an enormous amount of economic activity.
Ultimately, in 2003, Governor Frank O'Bannon didn't choose the 41 to 70 route. It wasn't even considered a finalist.
It's a simple calculation. When people run for statewide office, if it's governor, there are a lot of voters down in Vanderburgh County, the Evansville area. And the politicians, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have concluded in order to get a nice majority, particularly if you're a Democratic candidate in a somewhat Democratic Evansville area, if you're going to get that vote, you need to be for the highway. They perceive people in Evansville as really wanting that highway badly. And so most statewide office holders tend to become very strong proponents of I-69. And it's all designed to get those votes at election time. So it is driven by the politics.
Evansville would, after all, get its direct route to Indianapolis, winding through Washington and the Tokarskis' backyard. For each acre of farmland, forests, or wetlands eliminated to make room for I-69, 3 acres would be mitigated as required by federal regulations. New wetlands would be created, forests planted, and farmland restored to its natural state. 5,000 acres of new nature preserves would exist across Indiana as a result of I-69.
Humans, I'd like to think that we can do a lot of good things, but recreating nature so far is not one of them.
The mitigation is expected to cost about $77 million, and the company doing much of the legwork is Bernardin, Lockmuller & Associates, the Evansville firm involved in the project since its planning stages, and the company that, to this point, has earned more than $56 million from contracts related to I-69. Despite Governor O'Bannon's choice of a direct Evansville to Indianapolis route for I-69, Carr and other opponents continued to fight the highway. They filed several unsuccessful lawsuits and tried to persuade lawmakers to change the route. But their best weapon in this fight was money, or a lack thereof. State and federal officials could make plans to build the highway, but they had no way to pay for it. Federal transportation laws had shifted the burden of highway funding back to the states, and with the recessions of the mid-2000s, the states were broke.
They had a very strong argument for many, many years that this was something that the state could not afford. And it wasn't just an argument, it was also a comfort to them. They knew that no matter how, Evansville friendly a governor was, how unfriendly to the environment a governor was, they always had that money thing to let them sleep at night. Well, but they can't pay for it. There's no way they can pay for it. It could go onto the books, but it's never going to be built.
In 2005, Mitch Daniels was sworn in as the 49th governor of Indiana. Right away, the Republican governor began looking for ways to cut spending and increase revenue without raising taxes. One thing he'd been closely looking at was public-private partnerships, particularly as they related to highways. A number of banks were interested in the idea of leasing state roads. These investors would give the state large sums of money up front to help them with their struggling budgets. And in turn, the investors could turn a profit by tolling highways and raising the fees on existing toll roads, something a governor could politically never do.
He worked, I believe, in the Reagan White House. He was the budget director for George W. Bush. So he was a policy guy. I mean, he really knew his stuff. When he was running for governor was kind of this moment where a lot of overseas banks were trying to get this idea of privatization and leasing of toll roads off the ground here, and they were making visits to many state houses and talking to Congress people. And the idea, you know, it was, I was doing my reporting at the same time, and I was watching in Texas in 2002 Governor Perry running for re-election and saying he wanted to build this big system of private toll roads, and everyone was kind of, yeah, well, whatever, that's pie in the sky.
Daniels had said a toll road or no road when he came into office. He sent his staff from INDOT down to Texas. Here's what's going on in Texas, and I'm talking about the whole Trans-Texas corridor with this, you know, huge quarter-mile wide right-of-way, privatized with rail and with all the utilities and, you know, a whole big ball of wax. I remember being 2005 at the county fair saying, look it, we can't say for sure, but connect the dots here. We think this is what he's going to do.
And
sure enough.
And people laughed at us.
Oh,
said, this will never happen in Indiana. No way he's ever going to do that.
Never going to do that. And guess what?
Guess what?
Not 6 months later, he had jammed that thing through the legislature.
Mitch was a friend of mine, and I knew that he was a doer, but I did not know about the highway.
I didn't get up one morning and say, wouldn't it be fun to lease a state asset? I stayed up nights for a long time realizing that Indiana was $3 billion or more short of the money it needed to keep its promises to communities all over the state. It had really been a rather cynical exercise. Politicians had promised all kinds of roads and bridges and things, and I would meet these folks with these yellowed pieces of paper, you know. After looking at about 3 dozen options, it was clear the only one with the potential to generate enough money to keep our promises, keep the state's promises to people everywhere was the lease, if it worked, and it worked.
Just politically speaking, it's a touchy thing to privatize something that is physical, that you can actually see. You're not privatizing some backroom, back office process. You're privatizing a road. And it's easy to kind of forget now how difficult that was for Daniels. He passed it through the legislature with 1 vote. His approval ratings kind of went through the floor. I think he was booed at an Indiana Pacers game. I mean, this was a controversial thing.
Daniels leased the Indiana Toll Road to a Spanish-Australian firm for $3.85 billion. He dedicated $700 million of that money to build Interstate 69 from Evansville to the Crane Naval Center. The legislation called Major Moves was for early supporters of I-69 just that, a major move in the direction of getting their highway built.
We would be up in Indianapolis meeting with the INDOT people, and they'd say, we recognize how important it is, and et cetera, but we don't have any money. And so we come back and our head in our hands trying to figure out how we're going to raise more money, and then here comes Major Moves. I said,
I was very surprised and, of course, pleased as punch to finally have the money to get started.
Major Moves was a blow to the opponents trying to stop the highway, who were hopeful a fiscally conservative Republican governor would overturn the previous Democratic governor's direct route for I-69.
What we're out to do is to bring some hope and life to some of the poorest parts of Indiana.
They had thought Daniels would go with the cheaper route through Terre Haute.
Governor O'Bannon chose the route after the usual years and years of exhaustive study that we do in this country. Nobody else does it the way we do, but believe me, after all those years, everything that could be said had been, and Governor O'Bannon chose that route. The important thing to remember about the route is that to have tinkered with it afterward would have started the whole clock over again. So people who said different route meant no road ever. If it had been a decision for me to make, might I have picked some other route? I might have. I certainly listened. I met with everybody, including the diehard opponents, multiple times. But it was a binary choice. We can say this is a dumb law. I think, frankly, it is. A lot changes in 10 or 20 years since the first impact statements and all were done. But it is the law.
In all their years protesting I-69, the Tokarskis say they've never done anything that wasn't protected as free speech. So it posed quite a problem when a group of national environmental activists swooped into town to join the fight. Many longtime opponents welcomed youthful energy to the fight, but these more radical environmentalist actions often involved civil disobedience.
They weren't interested in lawsuits and petitions and the normal kind of political process. They wanted to take what they called direct action.
Their actions were motivated by a fear that the NAFTA highway would lead to globalization and a loss of American jobs to Canada and Mexico. Their direct action approach to protesting, including carrying flaming torches through Bloomington, dumping over trash cans, and protesting outside the homes of road contractors.
When this all started happening in Bloomington, the Tokarskis had a hard time with it because they, as people, were so strongly associated with trying to stop I-69 in a lot of people's minds that they were getting phone calls and people saying, look, if this continues, if you're behind this at all, if you're even friendly to it, we don't want to be any part of your organization anymore. So the Tokarskis sort of had to distance themselves from the anarchists and while at the same time saying, we agree that I-69 shouldn't be built.
When the state started construction on Interstate 69 in 2008, there was a groundbreaking ceremony in Evansville. It was a huge event with a band, catered food, and lots of folks who in some cases had spent decades fighting for I-69. The Tokarskis were there, but they weren't allowed inside. Security had been heightened amid fears that protesters might get violent.
I thought I was in a third world dictatorship. I mean, that place was surrounded by armed policemen and God knows what, who all. They had snipers on the roof. Stanley doesn't like to call them snipers, but there's guys up there on the roof with their glasses and stuff. They had buses with bomb-sniffing dogs in them. They had buses to carry people off, massive numbers of people to get arrested. And here's like
they cordoned off like the huge whole city block all around this convention center. They hype everything. They hype everything. It was so ridiculous.
When is it all of a sudden that we're so afraid of protesters?
The protesters were certainly in the minority. There were only a dozen or so, while the supporters numbered more than 1,000. Representatives from across the country, from all levels of government, celebrated the historic moment. Governor Daniels addressed the crowd from behind a podium emblazoned with an Interstate 69 road sign.
Today, we end the interminable waiting, the unfulfilled hopes, the empty promises.
Although Governor Daniels was the person who got the money to finally make the road happen, he recognized it was the folks in Washington, such as Tom Baumert, David Graham, and David Cox, who deserved the credit for keeping the idea alive through 5 governors.
I don't think it would have happened without them. They soldiered on year after year, decade after decade, and never gave up. I would think that those people who still disagree with the road would have to admire the citizen tenacity of a grassroots group that just had a dream of how their, again, struggling part of the state might do better, and kept on pursuing it. So I think the idea probably would have died more than once along the line if they hadn't been so tireless and determined.
We've had the cows up to the gate before and they bolt and run. Well, we've been close before, but when they started unloading bulldozers, when we thought we had a pretty good chance.
The first portion of I-69 was underway. It was less than 2 miles in Gibson County, but its significance was immeasurable. A year later, the first cars would begin driving on I-69.
I used to say that I'm going to be an old man sitting in the back seat slobbering over myself whenever they drive me on I-69. But, you know, I might actually drive my own car and drive this thing yet.
In all, I-69 includes 6 sections. The first section connects Evansville to Oakland City. The second section includes Daviess County and Baumert's hometown of Washington. The third section connects the Crane Naval Center to I-69. The fourth section includes Crane to Bloomington. The fifth section connects Bloomington to Martinsville. And the final, 6th section gets I-69 to Indianapolis. The money from major moves was intended to fund I-69 for the first 3 sections, or to Crane, but it was left up in the air how the other 3 sections would be funded.
So he throws 700 some million to get I-69 rolling. And I think it's to get the footprint down. So in other words, we've gone this far, we're not turning back now.
I did tell the engineers, look, let's get a functional road. You can always add to it later, but I don't want to take any more land than we have to. I don't see the need to build one, build a Cadillac if a good solid Jeep or Chevy will suffice for 20, 30 years.
Essentially, that means the road won't be as thick as, say, I-65 or I-70. It'll be thinner, with the idea that crews can always come back and add to it later.
You don't build it this thick when this thick will do for 20 years.
Construction has to be conducted according to state and federal standards, and although the Federal Highway Administration makes recommendations and has to sign off on any design exceptions, a great deal of discretion is left to the state.
Mitch Daniels essentially said, throw out the rule book. It's substandard building. One of the workers on the road said, we're calling it State Road 69 because of the cost cutting being done in terms of standards set for interstate highways. Everything from incline, everything from bed layment, no medians, cable, et cetera, et cetera.
But that still wasn't enough to get the project back on budget. Improving access to small towns was a big case for building the interstate. INDOT decided it needed to postpone building some planned exits in order to cut costs.
One thing that definitely affects which towns will win or lose when a new interstate is built is where the exits are.
2 ramps in southwestern Indiana that were included in the original I-69 plans were deferred and could be eliminated. This saved the state more than $30 million, and it made the exits that were still planned even more valuable to those communities. Washington, the home to some of the earliest highway supporters, would be the only town on I-69 with an on-off ramp along a stretch of about 30 miles.
Washington becomes a big winner. I mean, that's going to direct a lot of the development along I-69 to that very small piece of land, which is owned by the Graham family.
The highway opens up a whole new vista for people and a whole new vista for trade.
Building first-class public assets is a core function, I think, of government, and really part of creating an environment of opportunity that the one we want Indiana to be known for.
The road is now back on track.
I-69 is 8 years ahead of schedule and under budget. The sections 1, 2, and 3, which are under construction now, some of it's finished, We're budgeted at $700 million, and right now we're at $578, and there's one more contract to go.
The savings added up, and Governor Daniels says the road will make it to Crane ahead of schedule and within budget. From there, the road will continue into Monroe County and join Highway 37. Before the state could put the section from Crane to Bloomington into its long-range plan, it had to identify how it would be funded. The Major Moves money allocated to I-69 will be gone at the completion of Section 3, so Governor Daniels is turning to traditional sources. Traditional funding is a combination of things, but largely federal and state gas tax revenues. After Section 4, it's unclear how the road will be funded from Bloomington to Indianapolis.
We're in a position to complete sections 1 to 4, it's called, but really get to 37. And as I said, by the time you've done that, you've created much of the functionality of the whole road, since 37 itself is a good road now. I wouldn't try to prejudge what a future governor should decide. Should it be 5% or 10% or 20% of a year's highway budget till it's completed?
But the next governor could also decide I-69 is not worth the investment. Carr and the Tokarskis are hoping the next governor will be more fiscally conservative than Daniels. But regardless of the next governor's ideology, he will be faced with a list of road projects that's more than 130 pages long and includes well over 900 projects. It'll be up to the next governor to review all of these competing projects and decide which, including those tied to I-69, get funding. Meanwhile, in Washington, former Mayor Tom Baumert is simply urging the naysayers to wait and see.
I think once it's completed and people use it, they're going to say, wow, somebody really did good back in the old days to get this going. And I know when I started on it, I was black-headed. I'm not black-headed anymore.
The Tokarskis, meanwhile, have been equally dogged, devoting more than half of their married life to organizing grassroots opposition to I-69. They still attend all the public hearings, making their case against the highway.
There is no responsible oversight in this project. It's too politically driven, and the agencies will not buck the politics, and there is a serious lack of oversight. And it's hard because you tell people, be involved, make a difference, but then you're going to have to tell them, well, you can be involved, but then you're going to make a difference. You know, it's hard, and we really have lost something important here. And this is a democratic process that we should be very concerned about losing. And the politicians, they don't care. They're about power and money.
It won't be very long before people don't remember who the heck was governor back now, but they will be driving on roads and enjoying some scenic protected wetlands and things like that I'll always know we had a hand in.
INDOT estimates the total project cost for the I-69 corridor to be $3.1 billion. Opponents estimate the cost is actually closer to $4 billion. The road is slated to extend from Mexico straight through to Canada, thanks in part to a path of influence stretching from Washington, Indiana to Washington, D.C. Whether it was a confluence of extraordinary circumstances, the right people connecting in the right places at the right times, or a pork project pushed by political insiders, I-69 has left a growing footprint on the entire landscape. This has been a presentation from the WTIU newsroom. I-69, are we there yet? The documentary provided a look at the history of the road project dating back more than 2 decades to Washington, Indiana. We want to fast forward now and answer questions about the current status of the interstate. We've invited a panel of experts to the studio to take your questions. In studio tonight, our director of the Daviess County Economic Development Corporation, Ron Arnold. From the Bloomington Monroe County Metropolitan Planning Organization, Richard Martin. And the co-founder of Citizens for Appropriate Rural Roads, Thomas Tokarski. Thanks to all of you for joining us here this evening and for watching the documentary with us. We invited the Indiana Department of Transportation to participate in our panel, but officials did decline and said in a written statement that their efforts, among other things, continue to be committed to the accelerated development of the environmental documentation for Section 5 from Bloomington to Martinsville. We do invite you to join the conversation. You can send in your questions or comments to news@indianapublicmedia.org or call 1-800-987-9848. You can also visit our website at indianapublicmedia.org/I69 to participate in a live chat or submit your questions via Facebook or Twitter. Members of our news staff went to a number of areas around the state to find out what people had to say about Interstate 69. Let's first hear from a resident from Washington.
My question for this project is, why are there, after all these years, when we're finally getting a good road for our area to get around safely and to get our kids back and forth to college and what we have needed for so long, now that we are finally getting it, why are there so many people from the Bloomington, Monroe County area that seem to be wanting to keep this from happening?
Now, Thomas, since you've helped organize so much of this grassroots opposition, I'll turn that question to you.
There are many, many reasons to oppose this project. Environmentally, it's an absolute disaster. The state has admitted that they don't have the money to complete the project. All the presumed benefits that were estimated for it depend on a completed project from Canada to Mexico. That is never going to happen. So all these economic benefits that people are looking forward to are not going to materialize. Washington is going to have their interchange, and the Quickie Marts and the gas stations are going to move out to the interchange location, and downtown Washington is going to suffer. And that's the way it is with smaller towns like that all over the country. We are not stopping progress. We think progress means looking beyond building more and more and bigger highways and start looking at alternative forms of transportation, sustainable forms such as rail and transit. And we have to be much more concerned about protecting our environment in a world that is seriously burdened with problems because of the way we have treated the environment in the past. And global climate change is just one of those issues, and building highways like this is just going to contribute to the continuation of environmental problems that are causing us so many problems today.
Now, we have gotten pages and pages of questions from our audience, so I want to keep it going here. So we'll move on to a question from DJ on Twitter, and they said if they think Indiana had a drug problem before, she writes, wait until they build I-69. Is it possible an interstate wouldn't just bring commerce, but also crime? Ron, what do you think about that? Your community is getting ready for the interstate.
Well, that was certainly one of the questions that came up, but if you believe that drugs aren't coming to our communities now, you better stop and take another look. Now, is it going to make it easier? You know, we don't know, but you have to do your work locally to solve those problems. And to be honest, I don't think a highway as far as drug trade from Mexico is going to make any difference.
When we look at this road from let's think Evansville to Indianapolis, who are the biggest winners and losers? What do you?
Well, again, I can't speak for the whole road. I represent Davis County. I know what it means to Davis County. And as far as the documentary, you know, I thought it was very well done, very well put together. The accuracy, I'd just have to sit down and go through. But in Davis County, one thing that wasn't mentioned was the impact of Crane Naval Base. 5,000 employees, 1,000 scientists and engineers. And we were on the list to be closed last time. If that would go away, and they have told us, the government has told us I-69 was important to have it close to the base. If base were to go away, the whole area goes into a deep depression. And it's not just Davis County or Greene County or Martin County. It has a huge impact on Bloomington as well.
Now, Richard, I'll throw that question to you just so we can get Monroe County and Bloomington here into the discussion. What are the benefits and the disadvantages?
Well, the benefits are those that have been certainly touted in the various studies. There will be some that will benefit greatly from it. There will be some that probably don't benefit at all, and there are probably some that are going to be harmed. I think with any large infrastructure project, you're going to end up with a range of impacts. The MPO at the meeting, its most recent meeting, the subcommittee that I work with presented a list of what we presumed to be the benefits and some of the concerns we had about the project. There are a range of things on both sides, and it is very difficult to quantify many of them, and that's part of the difficulty here. If we knew how to quantify many of them, then these questions could be answered more directly. That's just very hard to do, and primarily that's because the information that's necessary to answer the questions is simply not available in many cases and is not going to be available.
I have a question here from Jennifer from Bloomington. She wants to know if a new cost-benefit analysis were run with the updated I-69 plans that cut off a couple of the on-off ramps there, would the expense and environmental impact of the road still be justified?
Depends on who's going to do the study. I mean, your documentary was fairly clear. It depends on who's doing the study in terms of how you ask the questions, how you phrase the answers to the questions, what conclusions you draw from those
Thomas, you
questions.
agree?
Yeah, the studies that have been done had a predetermined outcome. I mean, it was very clear. This is the same route they had chosen 20-some years ago. It has not changed since then. They've wiggled it around a little bit, but they have always known, and when they do the studies, they know what the outcome is going to be. The contracts that go to the consultants who do the studies depend on them giving the predetermined outcome, and that is what has been happening all along. These are not independent studies. They are very biased towards a particular outcome.
Now, Tom, I think you can help us answer this question, but how would you begin to realistically estimate the economic impact that I-69 will have on a community? Anybody? Ron, I'm sorry.
Well, I can tell you right now, since they announced the construction of I-69, I'm getting more calls, and we have to do our work locally. You just build a highway and you talk to communities. If they don't do their job, then they're not going to get the full benefit. But in Davis County, we've put resources in place. We've had over $30 million in private investment in the Westgate Technology Park. I've got 2 projects now that would be an additional investment of probably close to $40 million that we haven't been guaranteed we're going to get them, but we're certainly in the running, that they wouldn't even looked at us without I-69. So it's already had a huge impact to Davis County, and the road's not completed yet.
Richard, do you see that same sort of thing in Monroe County?
Not as much, because the environment in Monroe County from an economic development standpoint is very different than it is down in Daviess County. It's interesting to note that some of the people who are now in the tech park that he's talking about were located in Bloomington, so there's already been a shift in some kinds of economic activity from one place to another. One of the things that does happen as a result of changes in infrastructure is that you shift the investment from one place to another. So you almost always see investment migrating from areas of poor infrastructure to areas of better infrastructure. And that seems to be one of the driving factors for much of the touted economic benefit. But it turns out that there's winners in that situation are offset by losers someplace else. I mean, this is a balanced system, and what you're doing is modifying the balance points.
Thomas, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, one of the most important things now, we're hearing this more and more, is that for attracting businesses, you have to have an educated workforce. And I think that the state of Indiana is making a very serious mistake by cutting back on educational funding across the board. and we're going to suffer for that. Indiana does not lack for highways. Indiana is called the crossroads of America for a very good reason. We are 38th in land area, but we are number 10 in the country in total rural interstate miles, 6th in the country in total road density. And Indianapolis has more interstate highway connections than any other city in the whole country. So we do not lack for highways. What we lack is we lack a better workforce, and the quality of life issues are becoming more and more important for businesses. Clean air, clean water, safe communities, other infrastructure such as water and sewer, which is in very poor condition in a lot of parts of Indiana, is being let. We are overbuilding with highways, and we're losing those opportunity costs that could go into other areas that would really be more beneficial for attracting businesses.
Did you want to respond to that?
Well, again, I would not disagree with a lot of the comments, but what we have decided in Davis County, and we face the same challenges with budgets and the things that need to be done, but when you look at the big picture, and it's like the comment on Crane, there has been some shifting in jobs, but at the end of the day, we're trying to set a structure and assist Crane because they have to compete with other bases throughout the country for those jobs. So you have to take the bigger picture, and at the end of the day, whether it's education and workforce is a big issue. But what you have to have, the only answer for all of us is increasing the tax base. And the only way you can do that is if you have adequate infrastructure to draw the private investment to do that. Otherwise, there's not enough money in the system, you're correct, to do what we've got now. But the answer, in the way we see it, and I know there's varying opinions, is we have to increase that tax base.
I want to broaden the conversation just a bit. Terry is curious that I-69 was to be built from Mexico to Canada. She wants to know what's happening in other states, and even says she heard in Kentucky they decided not to build it and that they were using existing roads. Who has the best idea about that?
Pretty much all the states have determined that they're going to use just upgrading existing roads for I-69. And so that Indiana right now is the only state that's using new terrain, as we call it, to build this portion of I-69. So those states realize that you can't keep pumping all this money into these highways because it just doesn't make sense economically to do that. You're overbuilding and you're losing those opportunity costs for other projects.
Frank Dixon sent an email and wants to know, for every dollar we spend, how much will we get back? Do any of you recall?
Any projection like that was made 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or even last year is impossible to justify going forward. We just don't know. We don't know.
And I would add, what value do you put on a life that's saved? Okay. What's your true return? Again, I agree you don't know, but how you can't put a value on a life.
They're going to close 135 local roads for this project. That puts all that traffic now they say is on these unsafe roads. You're going to be driving more on those unsafe roads. You're going to have this interstate highway is going to be a major truck route. Thousands of trucks, literally thousands of trucks a day are going to be traveling, and these are hazardous cargo routes, so they're going to be carrying hazardous cargo. And then we also have to not forget that when you talk about safety, 3 people have already been killed because of the rush to build this highway. Several people have been injured because the state is in a hurry and is not following proper regulations and rules. And so we've had several accidents where people were seriously injured in a lot of cases. 3 people have been killed, and that's before we even get any very much of it built. And so the safety issue has never been a major issue with the state in all their studies about why we should build this highway. The safety issue is not going to improve. You put more traffic on the roads, you have more accidents, you have more fatalities and injuries.
Tom, a question for you. With if you can just put your personal interests aside, can you appreciate the position that I-69 may ultimately be better for the greater good?
There are other ways to do this. We don't have to rely on the interstate highway. Crane does not need an interstate highway to service its needs. We can repair and upgrade a lot of the local roads we have and get better service for more people and do it quicker in a broader area. And so the idea that we have to have an interstate highway and that's the only thing you can have that's going to be good for the economy is simply not true. There are many other alternatives. What many other states now are looking at is alternative forms of transportation, rail and transit options. And that is where the future lies, not in simply building these big, massive new highways. They're too expensive, they're too destructive, and that is no longer possible. No other state is doing this.
We've talked a lot about Crane, and we got a question here about it. Someone near Vincennes wonders when the highway will be open to traffic, saying they moved here from Tennessee and purchased a home in Vincennes to commute to Crane, and the I-69 corridor was a major factor in their decision.
It's my understanding that it will be open to Crane by December of this year.
That's highly unlikely. If you go down there, they're working in several places, but there was mentioned in the documentary that is coming in under budget. The promoters of the highway like to keep saying it's coming in under budget. That is only for construction, and that is because they are cheapening the project. Totally, those first 3 sections are going to be at least $1 billion, and that is INDOT's own estimate. The section from section 4 that goes from 231 to 37 is going to be ungodly expensive because they're going through karst terrain, which is very difficult to build in the first place. They've now admitted that they're going to run into over 1,400 karst features, and they're still doing karst studies and finding more of those impacts. It is going to be extremely expensive to get to Bloomington, and they have to use regular gas tax funds for that. There's no more highway or toll road funds to use, and so it's a long way from being done.
Once we get this highway built, where is the money for maintenance and repairs going to come from? Have you heard? And
have not heard.
Richard?
It'll compete with every other need in the state of Indiana.
Yep.
And, I mean, one of the things that is shifting, and it's been somewhat a concern in terms of how we go forward, is we have a tremendous need for 2 bridges, or a couple of bridges in southern Indiana across the Ohio River. And those projects apparently are being escalated. So they're going to be a major draw on funds for a considerable amount of time here. If you have noticed, if anybody who commutes up in the Indianapolis area notices that I believe that for the last 20 years, or seems like 20 years, there has always been some kind of rehabilitation or improvement program on 465 around Indianapolis.
Okay.
And it is one of the things that happens with these large, heavily traveled transportation corridors, that they do require fairly constant maintenance over a long period of time. You don't, in fact, as they make calculations about particular features they're going to put on the highway, as Governor Daniels was indicating, they're willing to build a road that's going to last 20 years because they know that in 20 years they're going to have to go back and do some repairs on it anyway. So they can incrementally pull that in. The difficulty being, without knowing what the traffic is going to be, it's difficult to make those long-term use estimates. That's the real difficulty they have.
The reality is, in terms of maintenance, is that there are, by federal estimates, there are 4,000 bridges in Indiana alone now that need to be upgraded, that need funding for those upgrades. And where is that money going to come from? The state is cutting projects all over the state. The INDOT is cutting projects all over the state because there's no money. They have laid off personnel. The state police have laid off personnel who inspect buses and trucks because there's no money. I mean, the state is desperately in need, behind budget, and in need of funding, and there's no source of funding that we can see ahead of us that's going to cover those needs.
We got a question here from Carmel, a woman named Marilyn, wondering if an alternate route using US 41 and I-70, but building a connecting link at a suitable point somewhere southeast of Terre Haute, a compromise route, was considered.
I don't see how that would be possible. And it's just like the 4170 route. We took a good hard look at that, and basically that does nothing for the communities on the new terrain route. So, you know, if you're talking about getting from Evansville to Indianapolis, that might have been an option. But again, for the folks where we sit, no option at all. It still would have left us isolated.
Washington, Plainville,
Greene County, Martin County.
It's important to remember that the studies have shown that if they build the new terrain I-69, that traffic along existing 41 is going to drop off considerably. And so that is going to mean a loss of businesses along that corridor, serious loss of businesses. And that is why a lot of the people and businesses over there do not support the new route. It's like Richard was saying, it's a transfer effect. There are very few new jobs that are created with infrastructure improvements like this. You simply move jobs from one region or state to another.
We have a question from Dave Parsons. He's asking, did the INDOT studies assume that all traffic from Michigan would use I-69? If the independent studies are correct, why should a landowner suffer the loss of property to eminent domain when there's little or no public benefit?
These are philosophical questions.
Well, I guess
I do not know what the I-69 traffic studies were done in conjunction with, and I believe as part of, a large transportation demand model that has been created for the state of Indiana by Bernard and Lockmiller, by the way. And it forecasts over a 20-year horizon the transportation needs throughout the state of Indiana. It does it at a fairly high level. And how they determine the traffic on a specific corridor like I-69 is based upon the assumptions that they build into that model. So I do not know exactly what they did. As far as I know, the details of those models have never been released to the public. I mean, they may exist someplace, but they have not been released.
Okay. Now, as we traveled up and down the corridor, a lot of the questions that we got, people wondering whether they were going to get an on-off ramp in their community. And we got one of those questions in Washington, someone saying, I want to make sure I get this right here, that if the interstate is on the outskirts of town, is it still going to bring in business? And I'm sure you've thought about this a lot as you're preparing for the road.
It's right outside on the east side of Washington, and there's ground out there that can be developed. It's close to the CSX line, and we're dealing with two main property owners, and both are willing for the right project to sell ground for development. And so I would say yes, most certainly. Now, like anything else, there's other infrastructure needs as far as water, wastewater that's going to have to be improved, but that's part of any project in these small communities. There's not too many small communities that have an abundance of those things in place. So again, we have to do our job. In Davis County, there's actually two interchanges, one up on 58 as well, and we have a huge Amish population, and there's 16 overpasses in Davis County to help out with that. And again, is it perfect? No, nothing is going to be perfect on a scope of this size, but I will tell you the majority of the residents, and even the majority, I believe, of the Amish welcome this highway because they're in a position now. Tourism is a huge industry for Davis County, and they see this as an opportunity maybe to stay home.
Thomas?
We have talked to a lot of farmers in Davis County, and I can tell you they are not happy about this highway. That is an agriculturally based economy right now. And so when you pave over thousands of acres of some of the best farm ground in the state to build a highway on, you are damaging that agricultural economy. They're not directly the farmers directly, and then also all the businesses that depend on the farmers being there. So this is not good for one of the main industries of Davis County, which is agriculture.
I want to take another question that we have now from Vince Sellers. He's from Washington, Indiana, and we got this question from him.
As I see interstates being built, one of the main things that I'd be concerned about is how will we find funding to maintain them after we build them, especially in light of some of these new fuel efficiency standards, which will reduce the amount of gasoline that's being used, which will reduce the amount of fuel tax that we have.
Well, that's something we talked about a little bit earlier, but does that worry you?
Well, again, you look at the transportation, the dollars, and what's out there now. Again, our position is that you have to increase the tax base. There has to be restructuring on how roads are paid for. There's no doubt about that. As there has to be a restructuring on how we address education issues. Workforce for every area that I'm aware of is a huge issue. But again, just the general education setup, there's a lot of changes that have to be done. And it's not because it's just going to happen, it's going to be forced.
I have another question now from Twitter, I believe, and someone's wondering, has emergency access through I-69 really been studied? And Richard, I imagine you can probably chime in here. Clark says access at Rockport Road would be midpoint off limits in Section 4.
Right. When the FEIS for Section 4 was completed, there is a mention in that study having to do with a road on, or an access point on Birch, I believe it's Birch Road, outside of Stanford. A application or the process of getting that access point approved by State and Federal Highway has begun with the submission of an application for it, which is consistent with the record of decision that has been issued so far. We had been approached at our last I-69 subcommittee meeting of the MPO about the Rockport Road access, and because that point of access was not included in the record of decision, there's not much that can be done to move it along without opening the record of decision, and that would be a decision that would have to be made by the federal government and the state government. We are pursuing the Birch Road access, the issue being that Indian Creek Township, which is largely responsible for emergency response because the highway goes through their township, would have a very difficult access from their facilities, whereas Van Buren Township, which is responsible for some of it, would have much better access because they man the station in Stanford.
Okay, we're beginning to run very close on time here and a number of questions, but Mark Nagel is saying, isn't the interstate system a model of national infrastructure based on old ideas? The past, not the future. I'll open that up to the panel.
Yeah, I really believe that's true. And we're seeing that in a lot of the states surrounding Indiana. There's a lot more planning and funding going into looking at alternative forms of transportation, into rail and transit of various sorts. That is where people seem to be looking for the future of transportation in this country. Gas prices are going to continue to be high, and with more fuel-efficient cars, there are going to be less gas tax revenues brought in. And so we have to look beyond, that model for transportation is simply was developed back in the 40s and 50s, and it's no longer appropriate to the world we live in. We need to be looking for changes. We need to look at sustainable transportation alternatives for the future and not simply repeating all the mistakes we've made in the past.
Last question here for the panel. What's the best case scenario right now in regards to I-69? All of you, 30 seconds.
Well, again, get the road built, get it to Bloomington, try and find funding to take it further, and then really sit down and help the communities along there develop what they have available.
Richard?
Right now, the best thing, as far as I can tell, is to get INDOT and Federal Highway to sit down with the local MPO and talk about some issues that we have locally. They almost are categorically refusing to do so.
Yeah, we need to start looking at, we need to start looking at sustainable transportation alternatives for the future, and to do that, we've got to stop building I-69. There's no reason to keep on pouring good money into bad. We just need to end it here.
Okay, we're actually a couple seconds ahead of schedule here, so one more thing just briefly. What do you do to get in? I'm just curious, what do you say right now to the Federal Highway Administration and to INDOT to get them to come to the table?
I wish we knew. The only lever that we have is that for them to get access to certain federal funds, they have to have the approval of the MPO. So the only lever that the MPO has is to not release those funds. And that has been our policy so far, and it may continue to be our policy. The threat they make is, well, we're going to cut off your funding for every state project. And there is some evidence that they've kind of been indicating that that's what they're doing in some cases. So,
okay, that's it. Thank you so much. That's our show for tonight. Thanks to our panel for joining us for this evening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going online. Visit indianapublicmedia.org/I-69 for an archive of news stories, a discussion board, and continuing coverage of the I-69 Interstate Project. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening. I'm Sarah Whitmire. Have a great night.
Support for this edition of In Focus is provided by The Herald Times local news app for iPad, iPhone, and Android. Use it to join the community conversation. To find the Herald Times news app, go to your app store and search Herald Bloomington. And by WTIU viewers like you. Thank you.